So I went to the Decatur Book Festival, and my animals clearly missed me. Maggie and Bo are trying to share space on my lap. Okay, now I only have one. Oh no, there they go. Two animals on the lap at the same time. You guys, two animals on the lap. Now Siko's trying to get on my lap. Okay, I have three animals trying to share the lap. This is not gonna end well. This is gonna end in chaos. So anyway, I left them for a while, and they're letting me know how they feel about how long I left them to go to the Decatur Book Festival, and they're growling now. Stop growling. You literally cannot all fit on my lap. You have no worries about Siku also getting onto my lap right now. He's gonna start barking. Anyway, so I went to the Decatur Book Festival. And whenever I go to book festivals or conferences or what have you, what I'm hoping to get out of it is never necessarily what they're designed to do, but when it is an actual writing class, they're designed to do this, and I still am disappointed. But when it's a conference, a little bit more designed to do this, and I'm still disappointed. A book festival is just designed to have readers meet writers, and it can be about pretty much anything. A lot of it is market driven, talking about. I'm going to put the phone down now that I can lean forward a little bit. So my notes from previous episode. There you go. It's market driven, and that's fine. That's what those things exist for. And so a lot of writers writing just telling people about what their book is about, which is everything's falling apart. And hold on, it's not going to stay up there. Okay, life living with way too many pets. My bird is also screaming. Moderate the number of pets you have if you want your house not to fall apart. But they talked about, what is your latest book about or what have you, and that's fine. It's not the thing that I find terribly interesting. So I was hoping to, I'm always hoping that I do actually learn something, which I don't know why I haven't given up on that hope over these years. Or at the very least have some sort of concept that I can grapple with. I mean, that's really the only value that my MFA had was I knew everything that they were saying was nonsense, and trying to figure out why it was nonsense helped me figure out what actual non-nonsense is. Help me come up with that. The actual non-nonsense. It's all gonna fall over. I don't always even get that. The best presentation, and this actually brings up sort of a theme to talk about. So, because it didn't give me much to talk about in terms of how stories actually work. Unfortunately, I say unfortunately, but what did I really expect? But the best presentation was at the end. I'm afraid my dogs are about to start fighting again. They're getting hyperactive because I'm shooting a video, so they're getting hyperactive, of course. Rachel Louise Snyder wrote a book called No Visible Bruises, and that was the best presentation. I actually learned stuff, but it was a nonfiction book. I didn't learn much about storytelling, but it brings up a good point about storytelling, and I'll tie everything together eventually. But I swear I have a way of tying all these things together. But the closest you get a lot of the times in these sorts of festivals, sometimes they're very directly about, here's how storytelling works, or here are some tips. That's usually how it's framed. framing things in terms of tips is annoying. I wish people wouldn't do that, because tips are by their very nature superficial. But a lot of the times when you hear any sort of attempt at wisdom about storytelling, it's framed in terms of tips, as if to say, I'm giving up entirely on reaching some level of wisdom. Seeker's now biting Maggie's leg. I don't know why you have to do this right here, or why you have to do this at all. Anyway, this is why it's distracting. Stop. I'm trying to do something. So, sometimes you get something like that. Like, here's how you write characters or whatever. One of the things that will occupy waste time, is discussion of routine, and I think a lot of that comes from just question and answer session, and a lot of questions that readers ask, or young writers, whose mentality is still closer to readers a lot of the time. It's about routine. When do you write during the day? Is it true you have to write all day? And a lot of that comes from just the notion that writing can be something that you could force through artificial processes, and that's sort of rooted in a hope that it can be something that you can force yourself to do easily. And I am an advocate of actual writing, actually doing the writing, as being essentially the only way you can really genuinely improve yourself. 10,000 hours, as I call it. And I think that's a lot of where the false positive of the creative writing education comes in. Is, are you really teaching somebody in a creative writing class, or are you forcing them to write and therefore they're improving through practice? So I'd have creative writing classes where the actual content was nonsense, but if you looked at the evidence of improving, there's a disconnect between actual improvement over time versus the complete lack of content of the actual classes that barely even qualify as classes. That comes from actually doing it, and so that's weak excuse for lacking a content of what a class should be. But that's kind of what a lot of young writers are looking for, is what's the number? And I see 10,000 hours in just as a phrase, but it's it's not like you have a timer that says, now you have reached your 10,000 hours. But it's just that concept of how long do you actually need to do something before you become an expert at it. So the questions about routine, for example, are sort of misplaced questions about what do you do that is successful that I need to do? Maybe it's just the time of day that you do it. Or, do you sit at a desk or a chair? And I watch I watch these YouTube videos all the time. And a lot of end up watching a lot of YA videos. I've went to a couple of YA panels. Not that YA is a big thing for me, but it's an area that is interesting. But I saw the title of a video was I tried to write like Brandon Sanderson for a week, and I was hoping breaking down sentence structure. Hush, is that something you need to bark at? Breaking down sentence structure. That's not something to bark at. You crazy dog. I'm being bitten right now. He's gonna knock over everything. I thought, oh, we're breaking down sentence structure. I love it. 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 Woof. Woof. But some of my favorite YouTube channels, like booktube channels and stuff like that. Hush. they'll do that. I really appreciate that. Like, Paperback Dreams will do that. Even though she's talking about YA books that I'm probably not going to read, she still, breaks down, or like 50 Shades of Grey or whatever. She still breaks down. Hush. Do I have to wait until you're done barking? I'm trying to do something here. I'll wait. I'll wait till you're done. I'll give you attention. You want me to just talk directly at you and pretend like I'm giving you attention? Is that what you want? You just want me to pretend like I'm giving you attention? Yes, I know. I left you. I know I left you. I'm so sorry. Daddy has to do other things than taking care of you all the time. Okay, I'm going to look at you while I'm talking. Hush. I will kick you out of here. Close the door if you can't shut up. If you can't shut up, you're leaving. Hush. That's your last warning. Okay. Let me try. Okay. Out. 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 You too. Both of you, get out. I can close the door. That was a bit much. Okay. So breaking down sentence structure, but the Brandon Sanderson video was just about, I wrote during the time of day that he wrote. I'm not sure why time of day actually makes any difference. And it's definitely not the deeper sort of wisdom about the nature of storytelling that, or even, crafty stuff like sentence structure that I'm interested in. But, that tends to be what a lot of people end up doing. There was one writer, I'm not going to name any of the writers, just because, I'm criticizing just the lack of getting what I wanted out of it, and that has nothing to do with the writers. That's, not their fault or anything. And that's the thing about, like, my MFA. I had plenty of nice people who were very, very kind. It's just the nature of the MFA was not what I wanted at all. Learning how to write, it was what I wanted. Learning how stories work was what I wanted. I didn't get that. So there was one writer who had this whole thing about outlining. She had a different name for it, but it was an outline. It was she was outlining what people know at certain points. And there was one questioner who was very impressed that she outlined. And I thought, why are we spending this time talking about just what outlines are? I don't outline, and I'm never going to outline. It's just a different routine. It's not, there's no wisdom to it. It's just people do things differently. That's the thing. If you've never heard of outlining, it would be very impressive to hear it. So, that's why I'm saying it's just not what I wanted. And it seems like a huge waste of time to me. But if you've never heard of outlines, I think that's another thing of the, one of the false positives of creative writing education is, if you tell a young writer, show, don't tell, and they've never heard it before, it seems really magical, but it's mostly just a trick more so than anything. It's not wisdom, it's a trick. So there's that. So that kind of superficial concept of understanding how stories work through that, that manufacturing of people's entirely subjective routines as a way of throwing yourself over the fence, basically. I learned more from Dr. Seuss than I ever did from creative writing education. And I learned more about storytelling from Dr. Seuss than anybody. But the other thing is, another thing that showed up, speaking of which, there was one presentation where one of the writers was lauding Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott, which, to me, Bird by Bird is one of the worst books ever published. One of the most irresponsible, I think is a good word for it, books ever published. But people love it, and I wish I knew why they loved it. It's just horrendous from beginning to end. And when I talk about just creative writing textbooks all being just really, really bad, I think Bird by Bird is the one most famous. There's a lot of these creative writing textbooks that I just can't remember the names of or who wrote them, but they're kind of in the same vein. The Ursula K. Le Guin one was probably the most disappointing because I had the most hope for that one. But I think that was the most disappointing in its complete vacuousness. But this one writer was just saying how great Bird by Bird was. And then later another writer said that she hated On Writing by Stephen King. Now, if you ask me, Bird by Bird would be one of the top worst books ever published, the most irresponsible books ever published, if Stephen King hadn't published On Writing. Easily the champion, easily the number one spot of the worst books ever written. He definitely has the worst single line ever published. It's something like he's quoting fake Ernest Hemingway, and I've mentioned before how much just all the different problems with fake Ernest Hemingway. But he's saying, he says Hemingway said "kill your darlings," and he was right. I think is the worst line ever published in a book, because it wasn't Ernest Hemingway. Even if it was, it would be bad. It wasn't Ernest Hemingway who said that. Robert Quiller Couch. Richard Quiller. Somebody Quiller Couch said that originally. Kill your darlings is a reprehensible thing to tell people. To present this advice that is not even your own. Whoever said it is, sloppy and lazy. And just saying they were right. Well, why were they right? Whoever said it. Quiller Couch or whoever. It was either Kill Your Darlings or it was one of the other horrible ones, but I think it was Kill Your Darlings. And the writer who mentioned not liking On Writing talked about how King made her overly conscious of adverbs, and it's kind of a small part of that book, and it's definitely not Stephen King's main idea. But the whole advocacy of adverb elimination, which drives me crazy. It's not a bad idea to be conscious of adverbs. A lot of these ideas have ideas in them that are fine. Being conscious of adverbs, it comes from, I would say, an aesthetic drive to eliminate gratuitousness and simplify, which you can associate with Hemingway. If you want to sound like Hemingway, knock out those adverbs and what have you. I don't want to sound like Hemingway. I don't like Hemingway at all. But if that's what you want, feel free. I mean, that's the way to do it. One of the ways. A bunch of other ways. But I'm not sure why Stephen King is advocating simplicity. There's nothing. He of all people needs a bit more editing. On a purely subjective level. He's very, very sprawling and sloppy and crazy with his prose, with his plotting. And if you read Stephen King, I don't think, just guessing subjectively. This is one of the many, 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 many problems with On Writing. But if you read Stephen King, you don't say, well, that's amazing prose. I wish I could write prose like that guy. He has such precise, efficient word choice. Stephen King, Raymond Carver, Ernest Hemingway. That's who I look to for inspiration and precise prose. Pared down, efficient prose. I don't know, that's like the last thing I would associate with Stephen King. Anyway, I could go on and on about Stephen King. He's got a great imagination. That's, if you want to learn something from Stephen King, it would be, how do you create an interesting, Munster. How do you scare an audience? Those are things he's really good at. Prose is not, the thing I would go to Stephen King for. Yet that's kind of what that book is about. And the aberrant thing isn't even his thing. It's just the cliche that you constantly hear. So there was that. So I'm not sure if the writer was even hated the on writing as much as I do, or just was bothered by how rigorous it made her. But that's maybe a topic for another day. Like a Bird by Bird, I ejected the entirety of that from my mind, so I couldn't even tell you what was wrong with Bird by Bird. All of it was just entirely useless and treated much of what it said as universals, and that's what's really irresponsible of it. People find it useful, whatever. I mean, I'm not criticizing somebody for finding it useful. I just think it's garbage. That's all. Just me personally. And also, I could probably prove why it's garbage, but I can't remember anything about it. Maybe one day I'll dive back into it. Feels like I'd be sticking my head into a black hole of oblivion and nonsense. Black hole of oblivion. There you go. There's a redundancy. I don't mind redundancy one bit. But anyway, that's something not for today. I mean, that's something that I could go on and on about if I decided to attempt ruining my brain by diving back into those particular black holes. But also in that same presentation, I wish I could remember the quote. I should have written it down. I was playing Roblox with my son at the point, and I would much rather play Roblox with my son, at that point in the day, at the end of the day. But part of it was in a YA panel, and one of the questions was, I can't remember the question, but it was sort of framed in terms of, in these trying political times, why do YA romantic comedy? It's something that people always do, and this is something that I wish writers would stop doing. But almost always, writers and artists have an inferiority complex when it comes to politics, and the ways they try to defend themselves take for granted that politics is always 100% of the time far more important than art. And so one of them quoted somebody, I can't remember who it was, they quoted somebody saying that if we didn't have YA comedy to make us happy, then we would be unhappy going to the voting booth or something like that. I can't remember the quote, but it was something like, and it's sort of a defense of the frivolousness of sort of this dismissed genre, this belittled genre. And, I have no reason whatsoever ever to belittle YA romantic comedy. It's a totally valid genre. It's magnificent for what it is, and I don't even mean to say for what it is as being in any way belittling. It does exactly what it's supposed to do, and no one should ever belittle it for any reason. It's not, it's not necessarily the one I would choose, but there's no reason whatsoever to belittle YA romantic comedy. And, and a big part of the conversation was about tropes that they liked. It's very tropey, and people, it's a very tropey genre. There's nothing wrong with that. People belittle tropes as being, here's a sign that this must be bad. There are all these tropes. And tropes are totally valid, and I talked about that before. That's the schematic, level 3. I haven't even talked about the rainbow circle. That's the schematic level. And schema are just part of any sort of story. Any sort of story has internal expectations of how order will play out. You present this puzzle, and the reader is expecting you to finish the puzzle. Whether or not is irrelevant. The puzzle in YA is, you have this couple who YA romantic comedy. You have this couple who you want to get together, or couples you want to get together. Whether or not they get together is sort of the drive of the narrative, and they hit these beats. And the value is in how effectively they hit these beats, or, just there's still plenty of room for originality in actually hitting the beats. I know I was criticizing Stephen King for not coming up with original advice. Yeah, I'm just saying, don't give Stephen King credit for inventing the no adverb thing. But you wouldn't give a YA romantic comedy person credit for inventing the meet cute or something like that. I'm sure somebody invented it, but nobody gets credit for that. But that doesn't mean it's wrong. I mean, it doesn't mean it's bad. And treating it as treating something as very tropey as being universal bad is a problem. There's no reason for that to be universally inferior. That's just a taste thing. I like romantic comedies, but I wouldn't bash them for fulfilling the tropes of romantic comedies. That's just what they are. You can even disappoint an audience for being trope free. So it's fulfilling its nature and hitting the beats that the audience expects it to. But there's always this inferiority complex to politics. And that's this is where the rainbow circle comes in. It is, there you go. It is a set of interlocking spectra. The spectra of, the core value of art is at the center. It's that visceral impact. So YA romantic comedy does that perfectly. Makes you feel things. It has that visceral impact right there. And, each level moves farther away from that core visceral impact. At the far end is the rhetorical level. So that's the one that's most closely associated with politics and things like that. It's designed to destimulate. So if you have, and then the setup for this conversation was, something like, in these trying political times. And they're trying political times, just depending on whatever your politics are. I have no interest in making a political argument, but whatever your politics are, it feels like something needs to be solved. So in a narrative, you have this feeling like something needs to be solved. This couple needs to get together. In politics, you feel like something needs to be solved. Some sort of crisis in the world. But the goal is to solve it. With narrative, the goal is not necessarily to solve it. Those crossover, they cross over just fine. So I'm not saying politics has no place in, YA romantic comedy doesn't have much of a place really, but and it doesn't need to have any kind of a place. But our society, and I hate that phrase, but our society is set up in such a way that we view this as a hierarchy with the outer rim at the top. So you can view this as a hierarchy really going both ways. We tend to view this as a hierarchy with the destimulating end, and destimulating mean driving towards ending the actual crisis, ending whatever is causing us these intense emotions. We want it to come to an end. So we view this as the top of the hierarchy. That's not actually how the hierarchy works. As an artist, you should view this as the top of the hierarchy. Society, especially Western society, is rooted in this very dualistic idea that emotions are bad, and if you have an emotion, you want the bad emotion to end, or what have you. Or emotions are a universal evil. Intellect is a universal good. And that's just a classic false of the universe, rooted in Greek concepts, of course. But if you view it as intersecting hierarchies, there's no reason to view them as hierarchies anyway, but if you view them as intersecting hierarchies, where the artist views this as the top of the hierarchy, the politician or whoever, somebody viewing, interested in politics and viewing politics, views this as the top of the hierarchy, and that's perfectly fine. and they can intersect and work together perfectly. YA romantic comedy is not really the place where they intersect or having you need to intersect. So writers of YA romantic comedy will look at this hierarchy, just taking for granted that top and trying to find some way to justify why would you indulge in the lowest part of the hierarchy. It's not actually the lowest part of the hierarchy, but they feel like they're relegated to that, and come up with a defense for, we agree that politics is the most important thing in existence, but here's why we have a place within that, even though what we do is inferior. No reason to consider it inferior. As an artist, they view the eliciting emotions is entirely valuable. You can make an argument for why eliciting emotions itself is has this higher moral purpose. You can make this argument. I don't know if it's necessary, but you can make this argument that without the eliciting the empathy, why would we strive to ease the pain of others? So even something like YA romantic comedy, I hate to keep picking on that one, but I totally support the validity of its existence. But even something like YA romantic comedy, which is considered such a lowly part of the spectrum, something like that, you're feeling something somebody else is feeling, so you're able to feel this pretty intense empathy for the characters. Without that sort of empathy, what really drives us within the political system to, take care of other people without that empathy? That's a better defense than just saying it makes us happy and therefore, I don't know, whatever. That's kind of like the catharsis defense, which I've talked about before, the catharsis, rationalization. Which I've talked about before. I think we need to get rid of the whole idea that catharsis is the justification for why art gives us emotions. It's still rooted in the idea that catharsis is that emotions are bad, rooted in this Greek idea that emotions are a universal evil, which is ridiculous. And that brings me to my favorite presentation from the whole Decatur Book Festival. Rachel Louise Snyder. She's the one that I'll name. I'm not really saying anything bad about the other writers. I just, it might be perceived as I'm saying something bad. I don't really mean anything bad by it. But Rachel Louise Snyder, she had a fantastic presentation about domestic violence, about how it leads to murder and how it leads to, all the different legal challenges to, keeping the offender in jail and, all kinds of stuff like that. Very, very informative. The book is called No Visible Bruises. And I asked her the last question. I got a chance to ask her a question about non-fatal strangulation, which is something I actually brought up in my video about catharsis, because I have been the recipient of non-fatal strangulation, and I never even thought to call it that or look up that particular law, which is a felony. But part of her advocacy is that non-fatal strangulation should be a felony in each state. It's a federal felony, but it should be a felony in each state, and the states have to actually reinforce it. So I asked her, in the cases of non-fatal strangulation, if you're going to prosecute it as a felony, how do you determine that non-fatal strangulation has taken place if there are no visible bruises? And she, talked about all these. If police are trained, they can find that signs of non-fatal strangulation without having to rely on bruises as the only sign, which is a great answer. Very informative, very interesting. I wish I had known. My life would have turned out so differently if I had known. But even in that case, this is my point, and this is the part that may not be very popular, but I think it's something that artists really have to recognize, and it's an uncomfortable thing to recognize within ourselves. But I think that's a fantastic example, and it's it's nonfiction, but it's still a narrative. She has a narrative, the beginning of that book about a woman whose husband was abusing her, and he was threatening her with a rattlesnake, and he was doing all kinds of stuff, and there's all kinds of parts of that narrative. And she talks about treating it as a fictional, setting up the tension in the same way you would a fictional narrative. So why is that a compelling story to us? There's clearly a political issue there. It's a marriage of narrative and politics that works really effectively. Whereas YA romantic comedy, there's no reason to have, necessarily have any kind of politics in there. You don't need to feel inferior because there's no politics in there. But something like a nonfiction book about domestic violence, there's a significant amount of politics there. There's a direct argument, like, non-fatal strangulation should be enforced as a felony, or, argument about all of these parole laws reporting to the battered spouse about the offender being out of jail. Totally valid, and this is something I don't. Having experienced this, this is my bona fides on this one. Having experienced this, and having an actual stake in this particular argument, and totally agreeing with Rachel Louise Snyder, 100%. I'm not saying that politics and narrative have no way of ever marrying. There's no necessary reason to marry them, but there's no reason to treat the narrative as the inferior part. So, totally support everything Rachel Louise Snyder was saying on the political end of the spectrum. But the reason why it marries with narrative is because the story of this wife being battered by her husband and all that stuff about the rattlesnake, and the whole family dies, at the end of that story. And just, she says she spoiled it. I haven't read the book yet, but she said she spoiled it real early. So I'm not spoiling anything there. But it's stimulating. So, the danger she's in, the fear, the anger, there's this empathetic stimulation. So it's an empathetic stimulation that works the same way as like YA romantic comedy, where you have, the couple, the boy and the girl, or the boy and the boy, or the girl and the girl, or the, whatever variation you have. You have the couple, and you as an audience know that they belong together, and they have these obstacles that they can't get over to get them together, and you have this anxiety. It's low level. It's not mortal anxiety. And I hate to say even low level. I mean, it's just it's a different kind of intensity to the stimulation than worrying about this woman and her husband coming to kill her. And a lot of times that's the source of the reason why we treat things like why romantic comedy is inferior, is because we're talking about usually teens and romance, and we say how petty is that. And I talked a bit about this a couple of episodes ago with 80s romantic comedies. Clearly I love them, but it's I don't read a lot of them, but I watch a lot of those movies. To All the Boys I've Loved Before, they mentioned that one. That was my dogs are still making way too much noise. Okay, so To All the Boys I Loved Before, I've seen the movie. I haven't read the book, but I've seen the movie. Perfect example there. That the couple wants to needs to get together, and that's a love triangle too. But it's so you have a measure of uncertainty and anxiety and desire for them to get together, as it seems obvious that they should. And then once they do, it's fulfilled. It fulfills all these tropes, but then it fulfills your desire for them to get together. But that's born from the empathy that you have. You have the same anxiety as the main character in that. All the Boys I Loved Before, I wish I could remember it just off the top of my head. She has got kind of a quirky name, and I'm blanking on it. Not a a native YA romance reader. Still totally support its existence. But the name will pop into my head suddenly, and I'll blurt it out. It's some kind of quirky name, I can't remember. So I mean we treat that as a sort of a lower level stimulation. But a narrative of domestic violence where there is mortal danger, it's not working the same way. We're drawn into it, and it's compelling because there is that violence and anger and mortal danger and what have you right at the center. And I think a lot of people are resistant to recognizing that the reason that story is compelling is because it's stimulating, because it feels wrong to say, I have this empathetic stimulation from the story of mortal danger. And, I watch, Dateline Mystery all the time, and my cousin was on Dateline Mystery. It's a story for another day. If my audience is my grandkids, and I treat it as that. I treat it as that. Who's ever going to watch this except my family, really? Your great aunt, or your cousin, your cousin twice removed, however the family line works, was on Dateline Mystery. But I watch, and it would be those awful stories, and essentially how it's going to end is, or at the beginning of the story, is this poor innocent person that's getting murdered. But why are you watching it? Because it's stimulating, and it feels wrong that it's stimulating. I'm getting this, empathetic excitement and fear and what have you from the story of this person who's getting murdered unjustifiably. When is murder ever justifiable? I don't mean to say it that way. But this innocent person getting murdered by, and a lot of times it's murdered by a boyfriend or a husband or something like that. I think most episodes, they set it up as a mystery, but spoiler alert, pretty much every episode it's the husband or the boyfriend. So, and it feels kind of wrong to say, it's stimulating in the same way that, this supposedly frivolous genre is stimulating, but it really is. You're feeling the same sort of feelings as the people in the story. And, your desire is for them to resolve it, but the actual narrative value is not in the resolution, it's in the desire for the resolution. And in that case, so like with the domestic violence story, in that case, the politics and the visceral impact do marry together perfectly. And that happens very frequently. That doesn't mean that's a better, more important story necessarily. Calling that is subjective. Personally, it's a more important story, having experienced that, having been the recipient of that. Agreeing totally with the actual politics in something like No Visible Bruises. On the subjective level, I feel like it's more important. But ultimately, the drive of the narrative is still this drive towards being stimulated by this empathetic sense of danger that someone's in, or this empathetic sense of fear or anger or whatever else. And that's sort of what I was saying in my catharsis episode. I had never had a relationship that was not deeply tragic, or long-term, longer than a month, that was not deeply tragic or horrifying in some way. And I talked about my first girlfriend attempted suicide. And I according to my perception, I know that's not actually what happened according to her, but for 13 years I had that perception. And how I wrote about that over and over again. And I didn't write about it in order to eliminate that feeling. I wrote about it to access that feeling, and reshape it into something else. And commonly people view that as saying, I would be writing about that to eliminate the feeling. And it was a disappointment when I couldn't access that feeling anymore. And so it feels wrong to say I'm continuously accessing some of the worst feelings I ever felt. But it's just the nature of narrative. And that's one of the things that you just have to face up to. It feels strange and wrong to even admit to it or recognize it. And I would say that would be much better advice for any young writer, exponentially better advice. The young writers want to know, do you write in the morning or in the evening? And then they write they imitate those routines, and it does nothing for them. Except the actual writing itself does something for them. But I would say, face up to this strange, difficult concept that all of those negative feelings you're accessing are the raw material for your story, and your desire to access them and dredge them up again is not to eliminate them. It's to use them and access them. And it feels wrong. I call it the masochistic guilt. That's just a term that I use for it. Masochistic guilt meaning I couldn't possibly enjoy. Enjoy, I would say, is a limited way of understanding it. And that's why I say stimulation, a more neutral sort of word. If you're, and fear can be more stimulating than just, a happy emotion. And happy things tend to, just be shorter term sort of art pieces. Like my rainbow circle. It's a very happy image. But it's, what level of stimulation can you get from it? Just relatively short. And like short songs and things like that. Like a romantic song could be happy, but a romantic novel is going to have a significant amount of unhappiness in it. So people are reluctant to accept that the reason that a narrative is appealing is because of the negative empathetic emotions that it elicits. And on occasion it does cohere effectively with some real world effort to eliminate that negative feeling. And in the real world, quote unquote real world, things like domestic violence, absolutely we need to eliminate those. Those are, horrors in the world that there's no excuse for them existing. And doing a story about it, the value of the story is not necessarily in its ability to actually eliminate domestic violence or whatever. The value in the story is in eliciting the empathy within the bounds of the story. The capacity of the storyteller to elicit this empathy, to spike the empathy, is the value of the story. But once the story is over, it can take on a different value. So the bounds of the story, the political value, is not the value necessarily. It just can be married together really effectively. But the lack of that marriage, I'm repeating myself, a lack of that marriage is not, is not a negative necessarily. But anyway, I think I will wrap it up for today, because at the point when I start repeating myself, I recognize that I'm out of things to say for today. And I have no outro, just to quote Paperback Dreams. I have no outro. See you next time.